You can keep eating, but I'd like to now introduce Professor Michael McKisson, Interim Director of the School of Journalism. Mike graduated from the J School with a BA in 2008 and earned his MBA from the Eller College of Management in 2013. He's the winner of last spring's undergraduate lower division teaching award from the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences. Professor McKisson is teaching the school's Principle of Journalism class to 100 students this fall, and he's also our resident tech nerd. He's expanding the school's drone journalism program as well as exploring 3D modeling and printing to see how the technologies can benefit journalists.
Thank you, Ciara. We're so grateful that you could MC this event. Please continue having dessert. I'm an instructor, so I'm used to people being distracted when I talk. The School of Journalism first presented the Zenger Award 67 years ago to honor those who fight for press freedom, for the right of the people to receive information they need to self-govern. The pandemic has made it clear that the mission of journalism and the need for a robust, free press and informed citizens remains vital. We look forward to an afternoon learning about CPJ and what they do to further that mission around the world. But before we do, I want to brag on our faculty, staff, students, and alumni a little bit. First, I'd like to say thank you to Rachel Mosteller and Mike Chesnick, as well as Andres Dominguez, Debbie Cross, Paloma Boykin, Martha Castleberry, and Chris Hojboom, who devoted countless hours to making this event happen. I know it's a lot of work, but we truly appreciate all that you do for the school and for the students. For the last 18 months, we've continued our mission of instilling the values and principles essential to all journalists while providing students with skills for life at a distance. But we're back. The majority of our classes and students are back on campus. Personally, it's been rewarding to look students in the eyes in class, have them pop into my office to say hello, and not ever to have to say, "You're muted." That was my dad joke. I had to get it in there, sorry. The distance, however, didn't stop us from moving forward. This summer, the school received a generous gift from Barry and Adelaida Severson to build a video and podcasting lab on the 3rd floor of the Marshall Building. The facility will provide students with hands-on experience in video and podcast production that will help them land jobs and create their own when they graduate. Construction is starting now and should be completed by the spring semester. Matt and Julie Harrelson continue to support the school. They established a technology and training fund to support both students and faculty during the pandemic. Using the fund, we were able to add swipe card access to additional computer labs so that students could spread out and use our computers to complete their assignments during the pandemic. All of our faculty have been hard at work, and I could spend an hour talking about their accomplishments, but the staff made it pretty clear that if I tried, they were going to drag me off the stage. So I'm going to give you some of the highlights. Dr. Redis led the creation of a new Master's in Bilingual Journalism program. The first cohort of students started this fall, and many are in attendance today. Dr. Janine Relly spearheaded an online MA and BA in Studies of Global Media with students attending from around the world. Faculty members like Roxandra Guidi led virtual workshops like this one, which explored the efforts of journalists working to unionize around the country. Alumna Christina Bowie was a panelist and was instrumental in starting the union at the LA Times. Maggie Zenger, who's worked with both journalists and educators in Afghanistan, has been working hard to provide aid and assistance during the crisis. Members of our faculty have published books, including Jessica Redis' book entitled Narratives of Migration, Relocation, and Belonging, Latin Americans in London. And professors Janine Relly and Celeste Gonzalez de Bustamante collaborated on a book entitled Surviving Mexico, Resistance and Resilience Among Journalists in the 21st Century. Sadly, Susan Knight, Linda Lumsden, Bill Schmidt, and Nancy Sharkey all retired in May. Yeah, we can give them a round of applause. The Fab Four, as we dubbed them, have collectively taught for more than 60 years in the school And this group has made a lasting impact on thousands of students, and you can even hear that with the folks that are clapping for them. Fortunately, they've all been named emeritus faculty and continue to teach as adjuncts, which I guess gets them out of the meetings and they get to just teach, which is what they love. But really, it's about the students and dogs, in the case of our first pandemic class last spring. All that we do as a school is designed to help and support our students who make us proud. Students like Clara Magoya, who placed first in a national student magazine contest for her story about a 2014 mine spill that continues to devastate communities in Sonora. Clara is now the border and immigration reporter for the Arizona Republic. Or Sophia Moraga, who's here today, she's got some supporters, who was awarded a student exploration grant funded by UAJ school supporter Jane Swicegood. Sophia created a project called Portraits of Our Parks, in which she visited several national parks in the West to highlight underrepresented visitors and employees through both photos and written stories. Current student Jordan Chin, who's also here, was nominated for a regional Emmy for his video work at AZPM. And in fact, he wasn't just nominated for one, he was nominated for 3. Dang. We can't wait to see you win one of those when they announce the winners in November. Last spring, Mike Chesnick and Paloma Boykin started a mentorship program in which they matched 15 beginning journalism students with alumni, including Cameron Moon, a social media producer for Red Bull Athlete Media, who mentored Gianna Memo, and Marissa Heffernan, a reporter in Longview. Woo! Those students, they're just wild. They just like to applause for their friends. I like it. Sorry, I gotta find my spot. Marissa Heffernan, a reporter in Longview, Washington, we'll clap again, who mentored Francis LaBianca this fall. We've added 20 matches, and if you're interested in mentoring new journalism students, please let us know. Our students are also getting experience out in the field through internships. Last school year, more than 40 students worked at various publications around the world, including Peiyu Lin, who is a breaking news intern at the Arizona Republic. The experience there helped her land a job at the Kitsap Sun outside of Seattle. Sam Burdett impressed editors at the Arizona Daily Star. Sam's here. Let's give Sam a round of applause. Woo. During her summer, she published 10 stories. It's great to see our students' bylines appear all over the world. Our data indicates that editor satisfaction with both their writing ability and initiative in 2020 was the second highest since we've been recording data starting in 2006. What's the result of this experience? Our students are getting jobs. For example, both Jamie Donnelly and Elvia Verdugo apprenticed at the Star and have been hired full-time because of their stellar work. Alana Minkler accepted a position as a reporter at the Santa Rosa Press-Democrat, where she works with alum John Deanna, who's here, and is the senior news director for enterprise and investigations. Whew. Our alums are also taking on new roles around the country. For example, former student Jenny Hijazi is a senior reporter at Bloomberg News, covering environmental air quality issues. Dan DeRocher has accepted a position covering Washington politics for the Kansas City Star. Nicole Santa Cruz, who also serves on the Journalism Advisory Committee, is working for ProPublica in Phoenix. Saul Loeb, you probably saw these photos, went viral for these photos during the January 6th Capitol insurrection, and he came back to speak to classes about the experience. Christiana Silva is writing about technology at Mashable, and Vanessa Ontiveros accepted a position as an education reporter at the Yakima Herald. We know, however, that not all of our graduates go into journalism, but we also know the skills they developed in our program provide them with the ability to communicate effectively and think critically. For example, graduates Eric Colesrud and Tessa Patterson are finishing up law school, while UA alumna Michelle Jaquette begins at Harvard Law this year. Nathan Oliveras-Giles transitioned from tech reporting to becoming the tech editor for the Apple App Store. And Tyler Smith used his journalism degree in a career at Nike, but recently left the corporate world and started his own brewery. Amazing. Cheers to Tyler and the rest of our amazing students and alumni. As you can see, a University of Arizona journalism degree truly provides skills for life. Of course, we couldn't do this without you, our supporters. Encourage and empower these bright young students with your wisdom through our mentorship program or monetarily through the envelopes that are on the thing, or by, if we're in the digital era, go ahead and scan that QR code and it'll take you right to our donation page. Yeah. We will ensure that it makes an impact for the students. Join us in supporting a strong free press and a strong University of Arizona School of Journalism. On behalf of the faculty and staff, I thank you for being here. I know we're going to have a great conversation with Joel Simon about the critical work that the Committee to Protect Journalists is doing. Thank you.
Now we'd like to show you guys a short video about CPJ.
CPJ is effective. To go someplace and talk to the Prime Minister or the President or the Justice Minister and say, you need to let these people free. You put them in jail because you want to shut them up. Well, you can't shut us up.
Breaking news, you are going to be seeing some video here that we have just coming in.
Tens of thousands of protesters are calling for government reform.
The growing crackdown in Europe and Italy, one of the deadliest days yet.
That they are already at 100% ICU capacity.
Protesters have taken to the streets around the world to protest against racism and discrimination.
As police crack down on the protests, journalists have also found themselves being targeted.
Local as well as foreign journalists have often been in the thick of it.
Move! We've seen journalists being arrested.
You might tell me why I'm under arrest, sir.
Targeted with tear gas.
Throwing straight at me. Sorry, we're under attack.
And being hit with batons and shields. Despite it being very clear that they are journalists.
In recent weeks, being a journalist does not make you immune to being harassed by police.
Abuses against the media are getting worse.
Over the last week, they've arrested dozens of journalists.
The costs of being a journalist add up when you're in countries that don't respect press freedom, and that's exactly where CPJ steps in.
Freedom of the press is the foundation of every single right you have.
We are not ending this fight.
They're aiming their fire now.
Even in the face of danger, journalists continue to place their lives on the line to bring the unheard stories from the darkest parts of the world.
You could not have been more professional. You were doing your job by the book.
I know they've been through a lot, and they are very strong, tough, fierce journalists.
I can hear Gwen right now saying to each one of us, keep your head down, keep working. Now is not the time to grow weary.
Very powerful video. Here's Professor Emeritus William Schmidt, former Deputy Managing Editor of the New York Times, who retired last spring, but plans to still teach as an adjunct.
Ahmed Wale Sirhadi barely escaped the fall of Kandahar. But as an Afghan journalist freelancing for Western news outlets, he knew he was a certain target for Taliban reprisal. New York Times columnist Ben Smith last week wrote about Mr. Sirhadi's scramble without success to find a way out. Then he opened an email from the Committee to Protect Journalists. "You are not alone," it read. "We are going to support you." In those panicked final days, it fell to organizations like the Committee to Protect Journalists to help hundreds of Afghan journalists escape. CPJ Executive Director Joel Simon and his team pushed officials in Washington to do more, demanding the Biden administration keep its promise to defend press freedom. They compiled a list of 400 journalists at imminent risk. And with other nonprofits, they worked to persuade Qatari officials to fly out reporters and their families. Many of them, like Mr. Serhadi, made it. Others have not. The Committee to Protect Journalists was founded 40 years ago. A rump group of reporters who came together to seek the release of 3 British colleagues who had been detained in Argentina during the Falklands War. The message they delivered then was no different than the one sent last month to the desperate Afghan journalists. You are not alone. We are here to support you. Today, CPJ is one of the most important global voices in defense of freedom of the press. Its mission is uncompromising. All journalists have the right to report safely and without fear of reprisal, which means CPJ will defend and seek justice for any journalist anywhere facing harassment, censorship, imprisonment, or worse. There are hundreds of names on its list. A Belarusian reporter jailed for her coverage of mass protests against the nation's autocratic leader. A Guatemalan radio journalist arrested for her stories about a local mayoral race. A Mexican journalist murdered in cold blood, one of 3 killed this year alone, because he would not stop asking questions about drug cartels. More recently, CPJ has expanded its mission to North America, where journalists, demonized by the Trump administration and its allies as enemies of the people, have found themselves at growing risk of abuse and attack. Truth-telling is dangerous work. Since 1992, when CPJ began keeping count, 1,416 journalists have been killed or murdered. Another 275 journalists around the world are imprisoned, the largest number yet. Another 66 are missing. To meet this grim challenge, Joel Simon and his team have expanded the organization's reach and range, tripling its budget and doubling its staffing. They have refocused its mission on the growing risk that locals, freelancers, fixers, and video reporters and others are taking as big media organizations closed bureaus and pulled back on foreign staffing. The frontline news gatherers most exposed to violence and oppression abroad are no longer foreign correspondents, but the people who work in the countries they cover. At the same time, CPJ has organized safety and security training to better prepare news gatherers for a world where reporters are no longer regarded, as they once were, as neutral, even sympathetic figures, there but to bear witness, but rather as targets. A brutal calculus that accelerated in the years after 9/11 in the kidnapping and murder of the Wall Street Journal reporter Danny Pearl, and a decade later, the brutal killing of James Foley, the freelancer who had been captured inside Syria by ISIS. During the worst of these days, as a senior editor at the Times, I often conferred with Joel. 3 of our local reporters in Iraq and Afghanistan had been killed. And one of our correspondents, David Rode, was kidnapped and held hostage for 9 months, along with 2 Afghan colleagues, before managing to escape. I remember the night I called Joel at home to share the good news that David was, at last, free and safe. Before joining CPJ, Joel was a working journalist himself. After Amherst, he earned a graduate degree from Stanford in Latin American Studies, moved to Mexico City, and worked 10 years as a freelancer. He is the author of We Want to Negotiate, a critical examination of the Obama administration's policy of refusing to bargain with terrorists, and The New Censorship, a book that looks at the global battle for media freedom. The John, Peter, and Anna Catherine Zenger Award has been conferred by the School of Journalism since 1954. Celebrating journalists and journalistic institutions that uphold the highest ideals of press freedom. This year, we are honored to present our 59th annual Zenger Award to the Committee to Protect Journalists for its extraordinary and courageous work. And we are also pleased today to celebrate Joel as you step down from CPJ at the end of the year, concluding an amazing 25-year career as an advocate for press freedom, including the last 15 years as executive director of CPJ. Joel, if you could please come to the podium now and join. And if you could join Dean John Paul Jones of the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences for the presentation of the John Peter and Anna Catherine Zenger Award.
Thank you, Bill, and welcome everyone. Joel, what a tremendous career, both in terms of the expansion of CPJ and also all the effectiveness of the work that you've done. And I just want to add that I can't imagine a job with more of a roller coaster of emotional successes and losses as the one that you've done. And I'm sure that, well, we all owe you a great deal of thanks for the people that you've saved and for the work that you've done that will continue to protect journalists throughout the world, including the U.S. So thank you very much. And now it's my great honor on behalf of the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences and the School of Journalism to present to the Committee to Protect Journalists the 2021 Zenger Award for Press Freedom.
Wow, that was very special. Can't wait to take that back to New York and share it with my colleagues. And of course, I accept it on their behalf. And it goes without saying that this work requires a team. And I'm very proud to have led the team of CPJ advocates all around the world. So thank you so much. Thank you to Dean J.P. Jones of the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences. Thank you to Mike McKisson, the interim director of the School of Journalism, and my host in this truly beautiful city of Tucson, the faculty, staff, and students of the Journalism School who have been so gracious and so welcoming. It's wonderful to see such enthusiasm and passion for journalism and such an abiding commitment to the profession. But my job as the executive director of the Committee to Protect Journalists is to defend press freedom on a global level. And that is why, unfortunately, I come bearing bad news. Press freedom is facing a dual crisis. The first is that journalists are under attack around the world. A record number are imprisoned, and that number has been rising for years. There are sweeping crackdowns underway in China, in Myanmar, Afghanistan, Ethiopia, Nicaragua, to cite a few examples. Governments have deployed the full power of the state against individual journalists. A Saudi hit squad murdered and dismembered Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi inside the country's Istanbul consulate 3 years ago. The government of Belarus hijacked a commercial airliner, forced it to land in Minsk so that it could kidnap a dissident journalist, Roman Protasevich, and compel him to make a false confession. Meanwhile, the COVID-19 pandemic unleashed a wave of global censorship that compromised the response to the disease and undermined freedom all around the world. According to annual indices, press freedom is in decline almost everywhere, including in the United States. The second crisis is distinct but related. It is a crisis within the profession that has eroded public support, not just for journalism, but for press freedom itself. 40 years ago, when the Committee to Protect Journalists was founded and the global press freedom movement was born, journalists were generally held in high regard. The US media had helped expose government lies in Vietnam, adding to the pressure to end the war. Reporting on the abuse of power by President Nixon helped compel his resignation. In other parts of the world, journalists were fighting for their freedom from behind the Iron Curtain or against the brutal dictatorships of Latin America. There, governments exercised what the persecuted Argentine editor, Jacobo Timmerman, called a monopoly on reality. Journalists were the only counterweight to the lies. In this context, freedom of expression and of the press were not just principles, they were bulwarks against government oppression. Today, of course, the battle over information is asymmetrical. There is no monopoly on reality, only competing versions. In this polarized, hypercharged environment, journalists are less likely to be perceived as independent arbiters of truth. And today, some people believe that free expression can be a tool of oppression itself, used by the powerful to subjugate and control the weak by bombarding the system with false information and harassing their critics into silence. There is, of course, some merit to this view. The legal framework that protects free expression, both in the US and in international law, is based on several assumptions. The first is that the ability to speak freely and express one's view is an essential manifestation of our humanity. The second is that speech is at the heart of political discourse, and that without free expression, there can be no accountability and certainly no democracy. The third is that so long as speech is not converted into action, it does limited harm to others, or at least a level of harm that must be tolerated. But a technologically spawned information revolution has changed the calculus, particularly about the potential harms caused by unfettered speech. At a time when information technologies are being hijacked by rogue politicians, extremist groups, and even state actors who hide behind free speech guarantees to spew lies and disinformation, when campaigns of systematic harassment are used to hound critics into silence, when people are unwilling to engage in honest debate because of fears they might be ostracized and attacked, it's no wonder that one of the central tenets of free speech is breaking down. But the argument that harmful speech must be brought under control in order to protect democracy is resonant of the apocryphal quote from the Vietnam War about having to destroy a village in order to save it. The obvious question in any effort to manage speech are what is to be controlled and who will do the controlling. Right now, the focus in the US is on the social media companies whose platforms were used to spread falsehoods about the pandemic, undermine confidence in vaccines, and spin out wild and damaging theories about fraud and stolen elections. I know that you are familiar with all of these debates in Arizona. Efforts by the companies to remove speech that poses imminent harm is understandable and to an extent justified. These companies are, of course, private actors, so are not bound by First Amendment considerations. Still, I worry that we have set a terrible precedent, one we may regret in continuing to empower the tech companies to manage speech and political debate, not just in this country, but around the world. I would rather that policies focus on limiting the tech companies' power to shape agendas and perceptions rather than on content moderation, which is what they leave up and what they take down. One way to do this would be to limit the ability of tech companies to gather data or display targeted advertising. I would also prefer that we focus on the actions of governments that are using these platforms to undermine public trust, including public trust in the media as an institution. The logical endpoints of government efforts to exploit media mistrust, to impose restrictions on criticism, is represented by the example of Singapore. I recall quite vividly a conference on global press freedom at Columbia University in 2010, in which Singapore's then Home Affairs Minister, K. Shanmugam, made the case that the media's own irresponsible behavior necessitated government censorship. Press freedom, Shanmugam pointed out, exists in order to ensure free and open debate about issues of public interest. Because the media is increasingly partisan, irresponsible, and sensational, he argued, this ideal is seldom realized. The media, Shanmugam asserted, should be a neutral medium for conveying news with commentary clearly separate from news. It should report freely and fairly on what goes on. The media can probe, it can ask inconvenient questions, it can expose wrongdoing. It should not join the political fray or become a political actor. It should not campaign for or against a policy position. Of course, all of this sounds eminently reasonable, especially in today's environment, but following this line of thinking to its logical conclusion, as Shanmugam does, he suggests that press freedom that does not serve the public interest if the media acts irresponsibly. In Singapore, along with many other places around the world, journalists who fail to meet government-imposed standards can be subject to legal action, including prosecution under punitive libel laws. Yes, we must protect press freedom in order to allow the media to play its essential role, holding the powerful to account and ensuring robust and informed political debate. But the problem with any press freedom argument based on positive outcomes is that they open the door for governments to impose restrictions if the desired outcomes are not achieved, and meanwhile, blame the failure to achieve these results on poor performance by the media. This is a trap we must avoid. Those fighting for global press freedom or freedom of expression should resist being drawn into debates with governments or tech platforms about how to ensure the media is responsible or that the information circulating on social media is accurate or truthful or constructive. This would mean engaging with governments on their own terms and risk legitimizing state intervention and control. We should encourage other institutions and constituents, civil society groups, journalism schools, of course, to work to improve the health and quality of our media ecosystem. This is crucial work, but we must not forget that defending the freedom of expression doctrine, that is the underpinning that allows all of this work to flourish. The quality of one's speech or one's reporting is irrelevant without the inviolable right to speak and report in the first place. We know there is no guarantee that thoughtful, responsible, or moderate perspectives will emerge from the cacophony. And it does not mean that governments have no role or that only an absolutist position is viable. Germany, for example, limits speech that would be protected under the US First Amendment, such as Holocaust denial and expressions of support for Nazism. But such restrictions stem from a shared consensus and the confidence that the German government will not abuse its authority. The point is that whenever speech is limited or restricted, governments are empowered. Likewise with social media companies. This is why ultimately protection for press freedom needs to be grounded in faith in liberty. There can be no more fitting conclusion, I believe, at an event that honors the memory of John Peter Zenger, along with his wife, Anna Catherine, who was his partner and kept the presses running of the New York Journal while her husband was tried for libel in 1733. Zenger's exoneration was an early triumph for press freedom and a solid reminder of what's at stake in today's debates. As you know, I will be stepping down from CPJ in a few months. I've been at CPJ for nearly a quarter century, 15 years as executive director. I expect this will be the last major speech in this role, and so it's natural I'm a bit reflective. In the last 6 months, I've spent my time not thinking about how to defend the broad framework that defends free expression, but I've been more focused on practical matters, like how to get journalists out of prison in Myanmar and how to get them out of the country in Afghanistan. I know we plan to talk about all this during the Q&A, and I look forward to that discussion. Saving the lives of journalists under threat is the most rewarding and essential work that CPJ does, but it is unsustainable on a personal level and does not ultimately address the structural issues we confront. I expect to devote the next phase of my professional career to dealing with some of the longer-term challenges I discussed today. We all want a media environment in which people are responsible and in which discourse is civil and reasoned, and in which people are not continuously traumatized by harmful speech. But if we empower governments to solve these problems on our behalf, then we risk becoming like Singapore. We have the power to speak up and to make our voices heard, and we also have the power to create a society that is just and fair and governed wisely. But there is no guarantee that we will use our freedom for this purpose. But we must try. For it is only when we use the liberty we have to participate in the process of governing that we are truly free. That work, which is tremendously hard and increasingly rare, can only be accomplished in an environment in which journalists are able to pursue the truth and are protected from reprisal. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joel, for those inspiring words. We're going to keep you up here for some questions. We'll give him another round of applause. Now we're going to keep you up here for some questions from the audience and from Professor Maggie Zenger. Her teaching and research focuses on the Middle East and Islamic world and the U.S.-Mexico border, including media coverage of the conflict and humanitarian crises. She helped train Afghan journalists and Afghan university faculty 10 years ago and recently tried to help some of those people flee the country after the Taliban recaptured control. Audience, you can still submit questions for a few more minutes, but we're going to go ahead and get started.
Thanks, Ciara. Where are questions being gathered? Where? They'll bring them to you. No, but I mean, I was for the audience to let them know. Everybody knows. Okay. Can you all hear me okay? Okay. Thanks. I wanted to pick up, Joel, this is such an honor. It's an honor for me to be up here with you, someone like you. I think all journalism professors have spent many years relying on CPJ to provide us the data, the information. I want to start, first of all, picking up on some of the themes that you talked about and that Bill Schmidt talked about, beginning with the national arena, and then we'll move to more global. One of the ways that CPJ has expanded under your tenure is adding a new North America program focused on freedom and advocacy in the United States. Can you talk a little bit about what led to that addition of the North America focus?
Well, when I started at CPJ in 1998, I was the Americas Program Coordinator, and I had a background in Latin America. And from time to time, but because it was the Americas Program, that included the United States. And from time to time, issues came up in the United States. I remember, for example, there was a journalist who did a piece for the New York Times. He was a freelancer, and it was on the presence of the Russian mafia in New York, and he was threatened as a result. And the FBI actually was kind of wanted to use him as bait. They were like, don't go to the media, whatever you do, because we want to catch these guys when they come after you. And he said, I'm not playing ball with you. And he came to CPJ, and we said, listen, he's not. He said he felt like a goat that was like staked to the ground in Africa waiting for the lion. So no way. So there were things like that came up. We also did a big report on attacks on and the murder of immigrant journalists in the United States who worked in languages other than English. Journalists who worked in Spanish, journalists who worked in Haitian Creole and Vietnamese. They faced a lot of a significant amount of violence, but we tried to maintain like a consistent global standard, i.e. focused on the most serious and significant threats. And there were a lot of threats to journalists in the United States, but they usually didn't rise to the level of violence, and there were other groups and also general councils for large media organizations that kind of led the press freedom fight in this country. But that really started to change. I think we saw a dramatic shift under the Obama administration, actually, which aggressively prosecuted leakers and really exerted tight control over government communication apparatus, and journalists who were covering the Obama administration in Washington found it deeply controlling and difficult to work with, and they were frustrated by it. I mean, Obama's rhetoric on press freedom was perfect, but the reality of covering him was really difficult. And we did a big report on this, which really angered the Obama administration. So we were on the map as like, having a greater emphasis on press freedom issues in the United States, consistent with our global mandate. But when during the campaign, Trump basically ran against like immigrants and journalists. Those were the targets of his campaign. So we knew things were going to get bad. But we also, like, Trump played this very cynical game of like, if there was a critical story about him, then he would attack the journalist, right? And everyone would focus on, did you see the outrageous thing he said about the journalist instead of the story? So we wanted to make sure we weren't like caught up in his efforts to actually deflect attention. So we created the North America program, and we wanted to do it in a way that was consistent with our approach, which was start with the research. And everyone was predicting a sort of, the end of press freedom in the United States. Now, if you were covering the White House under Trump, it was leaking like a sieve, and say what you will. I mean, there was a lot of stories coming out of there. And say what you will about Trump, he cared. And some journalists would rather be attacked than ignored, which was what happened under Obama. It was more complicated than people let on. So we started doing research. Like, we created this thing called the Press Freedom Tracker, and we started to actually determine the number of incidents that were taking place in the United States. And what we found was there were a lot more than we had realized. Like, journalists are under serious physical threat in this country. People were focused on Trump's rhetoric, and the rhetoric was terrible, and it empowered autocratic leaders around the world and undermined democracy. We've heard all those arguments. But what we didn't really appreciate was just the level of violence that journalists reporting, particularly on demonstrations. And the violence came sometimes from the demonstrators themselves, who were frustrated that the journalists didn't present their perspective, but particularly from the police. It was, we documented these very, very aggressive tactics by the police. Dozens and dozens of journalists, arrested, beaten, detained, harassed, and basically what we found was that the number of incidents correlates with the number of protests. Wherever there are protests in the United States, there are abuses and violations of the rights of journalists. So the idea was we wanted to both respond to the perceived threat of the Trump administration, but do it in a calibrated and rigorous way, consistent with our global mandate and our kind of journalistic approach to documenting press freedom violations. Sorry, that was a long answer. I know
No,
there's
that was a perfect answer. I think we tend to think that this doesn't happen in this country, and I think it's to CPJ's credit that they have picked up on this, because globally also you have noticed under the last administration around the world a record number of journalists being jailed for publishing false news.
Yes.
And today I heard somebody was arrested for social media terrorism, which is what you were getting to earlier, this threat. And can you just talk a little bit about the impact that the former administration has had globally?
Yeah. See,
with the
that's
rhetoric?
where I think we made a real contribution. I mean, like, if you think of Trump, you know, it's a kind of circular debate in the United States. I mean, it's definitely damaging to our democracy and undermines the media as an institution. But is Trump calling journalists fake news and enemies of the people a press freedom violation? Not really, because he's got the right to say whatever ridiculous thing he wants to say. Right. I certainly find it deplorable, but I don't dispute his right to say it. But what we kept pointing out is that what other governments around the world were doing with this rhetoric is they were basically saying, you know, you just complain about fake news, but we're doing something about it. You know, we're putting journalists in jail who report what we deem to be fake news. And a lot of countries around the world passed fake news laws, and they criminalized the publication of fake news. Of course, they determined which was fake news, and the Trumpian definition of fake news is anything I disagree with. So, you know, so that became codified and legalized, and basically provided this incredibly powerful framework for this global crackdown. I mean, I think that, you know, I don't blame Trump in the sense that these authoritarian governments are opportunistic. You know, they're cracking down anyway. They're going to look for any opportunity they have. But this was a gift to them. And not only that, you know, what could, even if the Trump administration wanted to, you know, what could they say, you know, when the president was using that kind of rhetoric? And we kept seeing, the thing that really troubled me was, you know, you may recall these press conferences with, like, Vladimir Putin and there were a whole bunch of, like, they don't come to mind immediately, where they would, you know, Trump would point to the journalists and go, oh, they're all fake news, and Putin would go, yeah, I agree, they're terrible, they're fake news. Now, if Trump says that, you kind of, you know, go like this and go, you know, what a stupid thing to say. But if Putin says that, and you're a Russian journalist, you know he's coming after you, and that the U.S. isn't going to have anything to say about it, and you are just on your own.
No
and
protection.
it was really deeply damaging.
Mm. Well, then, given that background, CPJ recently wrote a proposal to the Biden administration. And can you talk about what it is you're proposing that the new administration do?
Well, so we did a sort of a white paper, and we laid out, we sort of made the argument to the Biden administration that, look, you know, the Trump presidency defined itself in opposition to journalists. You can, and that it was deeply damaging to press freedom around the world. In terms of U.S. foreign policy, you can reverse that damage and also, you know, frankly, you know, reverse the way that the U.S. is perceived by embracing press freedom as a sort of priority within the administration's foreign policy. I think we partially won that argument. We wanted the administration to appoint a special ambassador focused on press freedom. They did not take us up on that idea. I still think that was a mistake. We did get a meeting with a number of senior officials, including Secretary Blinken. We made the case to him. He was, you know, very engaged. The administration has made very, very positive public statements about the importance of press freedom. That's very welcome. There's going to be this democracy summit coming up at the end of the year. They've said press freedom is going to be on the agenda. That's all great. But there's been some problematic things too. I mean, we were very disappointed, for example, because Trump basically, I called him an accessory after the fact to the murder of Jamal Khashoggi because he helped the Saudis cover up the crime, essentially. But, you know, we were hoping that the Biden administration would really reverse course and challenge the Saudis, and they took a pass. Now, they didn't do it in a way, you know, that was as cynical as Trump, but they did it, and the message was received by the Saudis. And I also think you know, the response to the situation in Afghanistan, you know, really damaged the commitment that the administration has made, because they met with us, they met with other groups, they talked a good game, and then, you know, when the Taliban took over in Kabul and the press was under attack, and journalists were, you know, at risk of being killed, and these were journalists who you've worked with, you know, there were a lot of failures in Afghanistan, but there were some success in building up the media.
Being one.
Yeah, these journalists were courageous and heroic, and we owed them something. And the administration could not bring itself to communicate that or do anything on their behalf. And that was noticed. And that was noticed by journalists around the world and by governments around the world. And I think they've done damage to their position, and it's going to be hard to reverse the Trump legacy. And the Trump legacy is very deep. It's very deep. So they needed to do something dramatic to reverse it. I'm not seeing that. They missed their chance, I think.
Yeah, I think so too. And that's why I think looking to the future, that does not bode well. I think the trust in the U.S. government to protect journalists in any way or to protect freedom is not going to be there.
Yeah,
Do you see hope, though?
I don't think the game is over, but I think that they need, you know, because I don't think they're cynical in the same way, but I think it's all a political calculus for them, and they're not seeing the political advantage in making this a priority, and they have to do that. So I don't think the game is over. And the other thing that that I think it's really important to keep in mind is the damage that's been done. It's like anything; it takes a very long time to build, and it can be destroyed quickly. So the U.S. influence, the sort of soft power that it's traditionally exerted in this area of defending journalists and press freedom, it's going to take some time and some dramatic acts to repair that.
Well, we can only hope. I have lots of other questions, but the audience does also, so I think we should get to a couple of those. The audience being students. A student is asking, is there any hope for press freedom in Hong Kong? And I think this is an area that has gone through dramatic shift in the last couple of years.
I know that I'm practically like the Grim Reaper here, but no.
Well, we're mostly journalists in this room. We're all Grim Reapers.
I really don't see that. I mean, it pains me enormously to say this, but I think that China has sent a message that this was an arrangement that it tolerated, i.e., you know, the sort of, you know, separate standards for Hong Kong, that they've made clear that that arrangement is over. The arrest of Jimmy Lai, who CPJ is honoring, the crusading publisher and democracy advocate, has really sent a clear message to the Hong Kong press corps that the era of a free-willing and independent media in Hong Kong has come to an end, and I don't see that coming back.
Unfortunately, yeah, I think that's, and yeah, and it shows you how quickly these things can change, and the rest of the world can't do anything about it. We're all standing by, like with Afghanistan, just watching it.
And I think it also shows the confidence and power that China is able to exercise, and it's a serious counterweight. You know, Biden has said, you know, that we're in this existential fight for democracy. We're presumably fighting against, you know, the Chinese model, which has an enormous appeal to many governments around the world. And you know, the fact that China, you know, came through was able to contain COVID-19 through massive state intervention and authority, and you know, democracy struggled, strengthens their hand as well. And so, you know, Hong Kong is the most visible example, but China is exerting power and influence in many places around the world, and that's really bad for press freedom.
Oh, This is similar to or in the same line with something someone has asked about. There seems to be a direct correlation between Trump's anti-journalist speeches and a decrease in press safety, or even just willingness to speak out and trust the press in the U.S. So has this decreased people's willingness to defend? Can I just say one thing too, because I'm saying this to students all the time. We all talk about the media, the press, like it's monolithic.
Yeah.
Not monolithic at all.
Yeah, I was going to
The good, the bad, and the ugly.
Yeah, there are a lot of assumptions packed into that question, and I don't share all those assumptions.
Okay.
I mean, I think I've tried to parse where Trump was damaging and where there was a lot of hyperventilating in terms of press freedom. I mean, that's my role. There's plenty of other things that we can talk about in terms of Trump's legacy and the damage he's done more broadly, I think, to American democracy. But when it comes to press freedom, first of all, Fox is part of the media, absolutely. They did pretty well under Trump. And journalists, so for that matter did the New York Times and the Washington Post.
We all got subscriptions.
In terms of like building an audience and doing amazing accountability reporting and kind of, and also there were lots of, like I said, it's a very complex trade-off because there were lots of great journalism to be done, right? And you had a very, a White House and an administration that leaked like crazy, and you had a president who was obsessed with everything that was written about him in the media. And so in some ways it was a very, there was a lot of amazing journalism that happened then. But where he did some real terrible damage, I think, I think unquestionably, is his attacks on the media as an institution and his norm-busting in terms of attacking individual journalists in this highly personal way. And the other thing that did was it also normalized a kind of mass trolling that I also think is a deep threat to press freedom. I mean, Trump knew that when he attacked a journalist, his supporters were going to go after them, and they were going to go after them not in a kind of like, I respectfully disagree with your, they're going to be, it's going to be, death threats and rape threats, and, they're going to, disembowel you on the street. So, and Trump knew that his supporters would react in that way, and he didn't care, or maybe he welcomed it. And that's a phenomenon we've seen globally, where political leaders in Brazil, for example, Bolsonaro, has a similar strategy where he'll just criticize a journalist and everyone will come after them. Now, the thing that people, I kind of got at this in my talk, there is a kind of free expression issue. Of course, people are free to be critical, and even call, the First Amendment doesn't limit criticism to polite criticism. You can be rude and obnoxious, and you can even issue threats as long as they're hyperbolic. Yeah, right. So we have a lot of. So the question is, how do we protect journalists from these kinds of onslaughts while still safeguarding free expression? It's kind of an ongoing debate. But I will say one thing about this experience, which is that if you have ever been the victim of this kind of onslaught, if you've ever been in the crosshairs of like some social media campaign attacking you in a very personal and visceral way, like no matter how thick a skin you have, that people are trying to silence you. And it is really, really hard to maintain your equanimity and keep going about your job and reporting. I really think it is a threat to press freedom.
Well, given that happy note,
I don't have a lot of happy notes. I'm sorry.
Well, these are difficult times. I want to ask you about your future, but first, this is a great question from, I'm guessing, one of the students. What advice would you give young journalists now, and how do you see journalism changing in the future?
Yeah, obviously I got asked about this in a bunch of classes. I mean, I'm not great on this in this area, but because my own career has been pretty unconventional. Yeah, but I will say, the only thing I'll say is, maybe be open to, journalism has changed so much that some of the traditional roles are not are difficult to come by, and so if you have a kind of narrow conception of what journalism is and what journalists do, you might be missing out on some great opportunities, because the kind of strategies and techniques that journalists use of gathering information and processing it and disseminating it, is vital in all sorts of different contexts, including social justice contexts and other kinds of causes that people are passionate about. So I would say, be open-minded to, and don't have a sort of fixed idea of what journalism is. It's evolving, it's changing, and I think people who want to pursue careers in journalism need to be open to those kinds of changes. Flexibility
seems to be key these days.
Yeah.
Well, let's wrap up with you. You wrote in the 90s, you were a journalist, as I think Bill pointed out, and you in Mexico and Latin America. I noticed you speak Spanish very well. And you wrote Endangered Mexico, An Environment on the Edge.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you've seen any changes to improve that situation since the 90s, and looking forward to your own work, since you are retiring after retiring from CPJ, yes, leaving CPJ.
Yeah.
I have retirement on the mind, sorry. But leaving CPJ, is there any thought to returning to environmental research, or what is next for you?
Well, regarding Mexico, the environment is still on the edge. Yes, I mean that's definitely the case. I haven't followed it as closely in recent years, but I still have many friends in the environmental movement in Mexico, and the issues that I wrote about, most of them are still present. Mexico City is still living day to day at this water crisis, and the kind of decline of the agrarian economy is still fueling accelerated rates of rural to urban migration, and the border environmental crisis remains. So it's a sort of static situation, but certainly I don't feel that the problems I identified in the book are by any means resolved. In terms of, I'll say this. I never really considered myself an environmental reporter, and I kind of made this point that I came to that book because I was just covering the news in Mexico, and I kept seeing every story I did, there was some environmental basis for it. So, I'd like to point out to people environmental reporters write a lot about, conservation and maybe even wildlife preservation and things like that. And I care deeply about those things, but that's not part of that book. It's all about people. So I kind of came into environmental reporting, I sort of backed into it. And, what I'm most passionate about is a kind of reporting where you're really listening to people and hearing them and meeting them where they are, and telling and translating their experiences in ways that are meaningful to a broader audience. And I could definitely see that very much being part of my future. I definitely have some books in my future. And beyond that, as I indicated in my speech, I really feel that the pace of work at CPJ was so intense that it was very difficult to step back and think about the kinds of structural issues and challenges that I spoke about today. And I'm not ready to talk about what is next for me, but I will say that that is something that I care really deeply about, and I feel that we have to have a sufficiently long horizon. We're not going to make progress on this in 2 to 3 years. So, the opportunity to step back and think long term, that's really what I want to do, and that's what is, I hope, next for me.
Good. We wish you the best of luck, and we hope you'll come back and visit us.
Anytime.
After the next book is out. And
I would love to come back. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Let's give them another round of applause. Now we hope you all enjoyed this wonderful afternoon. It's so clear from all of the inspiring words that we heard today how important journalism is and will remain in today's world and the change that is to come. If you value journalism and want to invest in journalism education, namely the students and faculty that you've seen and heard from here today, and the ones who will come after them, please use the donation envelopes that you see on your tables. Or you can go online to journalism.arizona.edu and click donate. Thank you guys so much again for coming today. Please wear your masks on the way out and please drive safely.